Welcome, Bruchim Abiyim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and this is Rebbitzin Katrin, your virtual Rebbitzin. We actually are graced below the camera level with the presence of Vasi, the still living, Baruch Hashem, Rabbi's cat, who's seems to be getting healthier and getting fatter, and we are thrilled that he is still with us. This is a very different, we haven't had one of these in a couple months. The main reason is because I've been finishing the book that I've been promising, which has been written. It's now going through the editing process and all of that fun that's there. So we have been focusing on that, as well as some of my adult education that I've been doing for BeitVirtuali members. So if you're interested in that, it's actually not that expensive to become a BeitVirtuali member, and you get some very good adult education. So we've taken a little bit of time off, and we had intended either this or next week to come back. And 2 days ago, one of my teachers and mentors passed, Rabbi Tovia Ben-Chorin, and there was no way that I could do a podcast on something else. And it's kind of a little bit of dancing on a tightrope. The Levaya hasn't taken place yet. This is not meant to be a eulogy. It's not appropriate to have a eulogy anyway before the Levaya. But this is a lot more that I'm finding myself having a hard time processing this. Tovia is someone that, and I'm not alone, as I've seen postings from some of my friends and talked to a few of my friends. Tovia was just one of those people that was always there, and he was always going to be there. And so him being gone is, it's been really hard for me to find where I am with that. And so we decided that we were just going to spend however long it takes to talk about some of my personal memories about Tovia. I'm not going to eulogize because it's not appropriate at this point, but this is a person who, the more I think about it, I've always quoted him more than just about any other rabbi. And he's had an influence in so many different levels. And as soon as I was going through the process of editing my book, there are certain things that I've said in the book that are word for word due to him. Just one thing that I noticed today as I was looking at editing, I say something to the effect of, and in the various different communities that I've had the pleasure, in which I've had the pleasure to serve, Tovia used to get so mad when people would say my synagogue. It's like, it's not your synagogue. You have the privilege of serving that synagogue. And I've argued with him about that. I would argue with Tovia on different things. You have to take responsibility for something. But yet here in my book, I've used his terminology instead of my own. And I keep on finding these things. So I'm very emotional, and I'm going in and out of numbness and emotion. So this is going to be maybe a very uncomfortable podcast, maybe not. I need to get some of these thoughts out. Katrin has gone back into her memory and thought of some of the various different things that I've said over time. So she's going to hit me with some questions, and we'll see how that goes. And but again, I'm not going to eulogize. But for those of you who have no idea who Tovia Ben-Chorin is or was, he was born in 1936. He has been a rabbi all over the world. So Germany, Israel, the United States, South Africa, Switzerland. He and his father founded essentially the first Reform synagogue in Israel, which I highly recommend you visit. It's been known as a yekish. So Yekis was a pejorative term used by Israelis against German Jews for a while, because they always would leave their jackets on until after Kiddush was made for Shabbos dinners. More formality that was needed according to the Israeli sensibilities. And so it's known as the Yekish synagogue. As a matter of fact, if you go there today and you're coming from outside of Israel, you'll be offered the English translation of the Siddur or the German translation of the Siddur. And how many places in the world outside of Germany is that going to be the case? But anyway, he was the rabbi at Har El. He also was a tank commander in Sinai during the Yom Kippur War. And one of the reasons I always remember that is Tovia was about as tall as Katrin is. And Katrin's not the tallest person on the face of this planet. And he was a tank commander because of his size. And one of the first High Holy Day sermons that I heard him give, he was relating what it means to hear the wrath of God to being inside of a tank when you're being shelled. And of course, now that we're in a time of war happening in the world, those images of what he talked about are now coming to mind. But I guess the last thing that I want to say before we jump into this is I'm trying to think of different things that have had such an impact. And I think more than anything else, it is his energy, but an energy that demanded something. And I don't know if I can work that into the questions that you have, because I don't want to lose that. He is someone that I argued with and did not always agree with. He is someone that criticized me. And those things are some of the most important parts of the relationship. I am who I am partly because this person respected me and loved me enough to criticize me. And that's awesome. And I think we're losing that. And so I want to get that out at the very beginning. That is someone whose criticisms of me and our disagreements and the elevation that we took. I'm a very different sort of rabbi than he is, although that does not elevate me by saying that. We have different ideas, as we should. But the more I think about that, the more that I think that me saying I am who I am so much because he allowed me to be in dialogue and disagree with him, I think that would honor him as well. As much as saying I give everything whenever I step into a synagogue or step into my role as a rabbi, which is what he demanded. So anyway, that's my introduction. I have no idea what we're talking about the rest of the time, so I'm going to turn it over to your thoughts and questions, and we'll see what comes out of it. We do still have a bottle of, this is still Day Drinking with the Rabbi. In Germany, it was unbelievably hard to find a bottle of Ukrainian vodka, which blew my mind. But I did find Medov original, and it is a Ukrainian vodka. So this is what we are l'chaiming to. And I have done many of these l'chaims in my life with Tovia. So this will be to life, but also to his living memory. And this has been in the freezer for a few days, so it is
ice cold,
quite viscous and ice cold, and I'm very excited to give this a little l'chaim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shechol niyeh bevaro l'chaim l'chaim. And that is, it's quite weedy, actually. A very weedy finish.
So we have to drink it before Pesach.
Well,
Finish the bottle.
Well, okay. So we've got a couple weeks to finish this bottle. Nice. All right.
Okay,
Katrin, what did you come up with as we thought of this?
Yeah, obviously. I mean, I knew Tovia and met him on some occasions, but obviously didn't know him as well as you did. So I don't have this strong connection to him. But as you just remember, or as you just said, he was always kind of this. He is this really. I think he's actually smaller than I am.
It's close,
and,
yeah.
But he always had like this presence, and he. I think he was also. I don't know if I can call it wit or something, but he always had this. Joy, I would probably. It was not like. Joy. I think he was always positive, and this is like what I remember. He was not, even when he was in thought, he was like still kind of this, had this positive vibe about him.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to better describe it, but I think this was really special about him.
If he was in the room, you knew he was in the room, and it wasn't from arrogance or ego.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of the things that I've suffered with is when I'm in a room, you know that I'm in the room, but that's oftentimes because I want to be noticed, and so I'm struggling with that aspect of it. But if he was in a room, and, you know, his size, it wasn't Napoleon complex. That would be the first...
Yeah, this is what I wanted to say. It like you never had this feeling that there is a Napoleon complex, but he was just this small man that I even, you know, would look down to, which is very rare. And I just mean it from the height standpoint, and not from, you know, just from the height standpoint. So I but he had this, he was still tall, and he didn't have this Napoleon complex. You didn't feel like, oh, it's a small guy that has a big ego or something like this.
His presence was, and he said over and over again, he focused on Judaism as two things, and he was a true believer in Reform Judaism. And I mean that in every... If you watch this, you know that I am a critique of streams of Judaism, that I, even though I'm ordained Reform rabbi, that I have critiques about aspects of the Reform movement. Tovia was passionate about being a Reform rabbi. He was passionate about that being part of a continuum of Judaism at large and knowing what we're talking about when we say that. He used to say over and over again, you need to learn how to speak Orthodox language because you will be in discussions with Orthodox rabbis and you have to make yourself understood. So you need to make sure that you understand what you're saying and what they're saying. He had all of this passionate... that was the entire idea. So when he spoke for Reform Judaism, he said, first of all, this is prophetic Judaism. This is the Judaism that comes out of the calls for justice that came out of the prophets, which, listen, I am all over the place politically, which I think most of you know. But if anyone out there says that there's nothing in the Tanakh tradition that talks about making sure that we take care of people in society who are more vulnerable than we do, then you have never read the Tanakh and you have no idea what the prophets say. So, this idea that Reform tradition is absolutely inspired by this critique of institutional Judaism. That was absolutely in his mind. But he also said, we are modern day priests. And what he meant by that was not a sacrificial job, but what he meant was this idea of you do not hide your light. When you are out in the world needs to be able to come up to you and say, you are a Jew and you are a representative for Judaism. And so he never hid that was the case. I literally sat there with my dear friend Rabbi Yonah Zimon and Tovia outside of his house at Adenauerplatz in Berlin, and we had a drunk guy come up and make a Hitler salute to us, and I wanted to hurt this person. I wanted to get violent. I was so angry, and I watched my friend Yonah shrug his shoulders and say that might be the best day of his life, and I watched Tovia think through the process with just a gentle heart after he knew that we were all safe and everything like that, and just want us to talk about it. And we started analyzing what was going on. Yeah. Unbelievable. Just a soul that was nothing but passion, but still was willing to engage in whatever happened. And he was willing to engage in that guy. Oh, one other thing, maybe it's on your questions, but another thing that I learned from him that I just want to get out there, that has became central as a community rabbi in Germany, he was pathological about when he left the synagogue, he would go to all security people and all police and thank them for the job that they did. And you've seen me do that. I mean, you know that that's the case. This idea of doesn't matter what, and he was the same thing. I saw him do this with every member of the staff, no matter what they did. And not too many people do that. Even people who think that they really try to see everyone equally. Tovia is one of the few people I've ever seen in my life that if he saw someone that was working for the community, and you fill in the blanks on whatever that job was for the community, whether it be the cantor, whether it be someone who was cleaning up after the services, whether it be security, he went up, he thanked them, and it was not arbitrary, it was not false. He was truly showing his gratitude that they were a part of that entire process. And that's really cool. Yeah, I agree with you. Of course, you, as you studied with him or start from him, I don't know. Both, actually. Both, I guess. For a long time. Of course, you mentioned him or quoted him on a lot of occasions, and I think probably the most known already quote that you said that comes from him was that I'm a primitive man and I need external symbols to tell me internal truths. Yeah, so I'm a primitive man. I require external symbols to remind me of internal truths. That was the word. It was funny, the last time I saw Tovia, and if you haven't heard me use that quote, then you just haven't watched many of my videos or been to many of my services. That will come up in every adult education. It will come up in about 1 out of every 10 sermons, I guess. When I last saw Tovia, I told him that quote I use all the time. He's like, that's a pretty good quote. I don't remember saying that.
Yeah,
Which I think is one of the points. I mean, you get to someone's, Tovia is born in 36. You get someone who has taught and served in as many places and many capacities as he has. Here's someone who is given so much wisdom that I can take something as one of the central points of how I understand Judaism. And he didn't even remember that he had made that point. It was for him a throwaway moment. It was in a sermon at Pestalozzi-Strasse in Berlin that he said this. And I remember him saying at least one other time teaching us at Geiger, my rabbinical school, the Abraham Geiger Kolleg. And, but for him, it's like, yeah, no, it's a pretty good quote, but it was not central to how he communicates his stuff. That was just part of the thing that came out as he was trying to communicate something. And what he meant by that, and the reason I think that's so important, because he was so passionate about Reform Judaism, he was as equally passionate about Judaism in general. And that meant, he laid tefillin with us every time we prayed shacharit. He's very, very traditional in his observance. And, we had, I know I've talked about this before, when we had families visiting us from the States for the Abraham Geiger Kolleg, the people from the States would oftentimes say, if I didn't know better, I'd say this was Orthodox ritual. And the answer is just that Reform manifests itself differently in different countries and in different traditions. But he was incredibly traditional in how he viewed a lot of the liturgy. One of the first things he ever said to me in my first year of rabbinical school in Jerusalem, he said, you need to get to the point as quickly as possible to where if someone says, I need you to lead this, that you don't have to prepare, you grab the siddur, you step up and you do it. And he meant that. And I did that because he said, you will do that. But, he was one of those people who I watched it happen on multiple occasions that he would then be asked, hey, Rabbi, could you give us a drasha in the middle of a Friday evening service 5 minutes before a point where a drasha would be given? He'd get up, and he had about 5 that he would be prepared to give at any one time, but he just knew that would happen. So his point of, I require external symbols to remind me of internal realities, what he meant by that was, let's stop mocking the trappings, the ritual trappings of Judaism that might seem backwards. And he was talking about a tallis and tefillin and Shabbos candles and even the Torah scroll. What he was talking about is, yeah, sure, we can go ahead and look at the tefillin and see that this idea of strapping the words of God into our foreheads and onto our arms is a very primitive sort of way of using almost a magical amulet sort of tradition. You shall take these words I command you today and bind them between your eyes and bind them as a sign upon your hand. But what he said is that might be the case, but I'm not fully formed yet. I'm not a tzaddik. I am not a prophet. I am not a person who has so much wisdom that I can just figure this out by myself. And so I need to wake up every single day and I need to see God's name on my body. I need to feel something tangibly that reminds me that I'm connected to something bigger than I am. And so instead of feeling like, and I've heard so many people say things like this, instead of feeling like we're being put upon by obligations, he saw it as an opportunity to learn something from a symbol that would point to something deeper inside of him. And the second part of that is, and he always understood that he had something to learn. As old as he got and as many things as he did in his life, that he never lost that moment of, I can still learn from putting on my tallis today. I can still learn something from reciting a blessing. I can still learn something from lighting the Shabbos candles. And I can still learn something, the Birkat HaMazon. And boy, oh boy, did he have things that he taught us about the Birkat HaMazon, the blessings after the meals. And so that quote I use all the time because I think when you are a non-Orthodox rabbi or you don't serve primarily in Orthodox synagogues, you don't have this self-evident Judaism. You don't have this necessarily, and I shouldn't make global statements like that, but, listen, early Reform Judaism in America literally mocked things like the kippah, like tallis, like tefillin. We've got Abraham Yeshua Heschel, who came from a more traditional situation, and he serving as a professor at HUC, and I think it was Cincinnati, maybe it was New York. Sorry that I don't know history on that one. He wrote later on that he was mocked by his colleagues who would tell him to take his yarmulke off. And so this is something that has gone through Reformed tradition on, these are silly symbols. We are above that. And Tovia said, I am not above it. I actually need to learn something. I can learn something by putting something on my head which reminds me to be humble in the act of learning or the act of praying. I can still learn something by wrapping myself in a garment that tells me that this moment is not the same as every other moment. And that's a good reminder, because I think we all do something enough. We have this idea that we've figured it out. And he essentially said, I'm never going to figure this out. I've got something to learn tomorrow from it as well. So that's why I quote that all the time. And that's why I think that might be one of the central themes of my personal rabbinate. A throwaway line from him, and it becomes one of the most important things that I can possibly express.
Like, do you remember any class from your rabbinical studies that you had with him that was special?
Oh, I mean...
you said this the statement about the primitive man was from a sermon, but...
So when I was at Abraham Geiger Kolleg, Tovia was teaching at the University of Potsdam at the time, and just a variety of different classes. But he was our spiritual director, so his primary responsibility was teaching practical rabbinics, and so practical rabbinics was all about, okay, it's now Passover. What are you going to do? And this is something that I had thought that I'd say at the beginning, and I'll go ahead and say it now because it's perfect. A little bit of an idea of who was this man? How did he exist in that capacity? What was it like to have someone like this as your teacher? This I'll remember very clearly. I was a student rabbi in Hanover, and the rabbi of that community was not available when someone died. He was, I believe, on vacation. He was just not there. And so I had been there about a year. They knew me well enough, and they asked me if I would do the funeral, which I had to get permission from the rabbinical school, it's over 10 years ago, in order to be able to do that, because it's kind of a big deal. And so I said, sure, I would do it. And I remember very clearly that it was something like 9:45 p.m. on the night before, because this all happened in the course of a few hours. This person's died. We need you to come tomorrow to do this. I'd never done a funeral before. We had gone over life cycle events. Learning and doing are two very different things. Tovia had taught on that, so I had all the materials from him, and I called him up at 9:45, and I said, Tovia, I have a funeral tomorrow. I'm nervous about it. He said, come over.
Yeah. And he lived across the street.
He lived a little bit away, but he's come over, walked over to his house, and he spent, I think, about 2 hours with me, walking through the ritual again, making sure I felt comfortable with everything, answering every one of my questions, practicing certain things with me. I mean, he was in his late 70s at the time, and just there wasn't even a hesitation or thought. So the classes with Tovia were the formal ones at the Geiger Kolleg, where we learned the theme. So we'd have one semester would be the theme of life cycle events, and one semester would be the theme of minor holidays, and one, et cetera, et cetera. So we went through that over the course of the time at Geiger. But the rest of the learning was going to his house for Shabbos dinner, where if you messed up on your Hebrew during the Birkat Hamazon, he would stop you and correct you and make you repeat it, because he had a reason for it. He said, when you are out as a student rabbi, one of the first things you'll be asked to do is a Birkat Hamazon, and you are representing yourself, you're representing Abraham Geiger Kolleg, and you're representing Reform Judaism, because in Germany, you might be at an Einheitsgemeinde, which community congregation that's meant to serve all streams of Judaism, and 99.9% of the time in Germany is Orthodox. And so you're representing all this. And so his correction was, you need to get it right. So he would stop you and he would correct you. And if you were using a bencher that had a text in it that was a very Orthodox text, and maybe that there were changes that were sometimes made in Reform, and you didn't make the change, he would say, do you know what you're saying? Do you have a reason behind it? Are you okay with that? And he would stop you, talk you through it. So there were as much classes on going to synagogue with him before he took over Pestalozzi Strasse. I'd go to Frankenhofer in Berlin with him, and with Adina quite a bit, and sit there, and he would talk about, I want you to pay attention right now. This is really cool what's happening here. This is how it's happening. Do you know? So what was my class with him? My class was standing on the side of the road in a 2-hour conversation. My class was having dinner with him and Adina, his amazing life partner, who's Philly, and I haven't had a chance to talk with Adina yet, so I'm not talking about Adina much until I get a chance to actually talk with her. But that was my class. My class was any second that you were with him, he was your teacher, and not in any way that was anything other than the appropriate thing to do. He was the teacher, he was the mentor, and he never stopped teaching.
Yeah. I mean, it's really nice.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, the cat is a little bit distracting. Yeah, I mean, you also told me once a story that when you had your first vocal solo as as a rabbinical student, and how Tovia criticized you, as we are already, and I mean, it's kind of criticize is maybe a tough word or whatnot.
But
it's
why
kind
did this
of
become such a horrible, dirty concept when it can?
Yeah.
Okay, so this was in Jerusalem, and so Geiger's at this particular point in time, Abraham Geiger students and Leo Beck students were studying in their first year with HUC. That's changed a little bit now on how that works. So all Reform students from the major seminaries in England, Germany, and the United States were all together, and that was an amazing experience on multiple levels. Of course, with my great American accent, people were very surprised that I was a German student there, which I played up as often as I could. Like, I know I have a very good American accent, and I've worked very hard to have some really good American. Anyway, that was fun until they realized I was actually born in America. But anyway, Tovia was the rabbi in residence that year, so he had come down from Geiger to be with all of us because there were 7 of us that were down there. There were 5 older students who were studying partially at HEC and partially at Steinsaltz Yeshiva, and then there were 2 of us who were first-year students who were full-time at Hebrew Union College. And because I'm a musician, I have a musical background. I'm not a vocalist, a trained vocalist by any stretch of the imagination, although I've worked on that, which is a part of this story. And Tovia knew that I was a musician, and he knew that I actually could project a little bit because during my interviews, he was one of the people I interviewed with for rabbinical school, and I had mentioned that I chant Torah regularly at my synagogue in Seattle and at the time, and he said, well, let's hear it. And so I chanted a little bit of Torah, and a trope that I don't use anymore. And I remember very clearly him sitting there with his eyes closed like he would, looking like he was in ecstasy, enjoying it. And he must have been in so much pain because I know how bad my Hebrew was at the time and my pronunciation. I know how bad it was. So just that was a very gracious thing. But he knew that I had a musical background. He'd heard me by that point play clarinet. He'd heard me by that point play piano. So he had expectations of me as a musician. He also had expectations of me as a presenter. He'd heard me give my first drasha at that point, and he was very happy with. He actually quoted my drasha in his High Holy Day sermon, which I will never forget, which is really strange. It was about seeing the face of God, strangely enough. It was for Vizot HaBracha. So my vocal solo, I started actually, because I was a musician, I was allowed to take most of the classes with the cantorial students, which thank you, Eliyahu Schleifer, for being such a mensch, and thank you, Tamar Hovilio, for allowing that to happen. And I just didn't take music theory, but I basically did the rest of the double program, and I'm so grateful for everyone. But I got a vocal solo for the High Holy Days, and it was Louis Lewandowski's Kedushat Hashem. And it was being gentle with me on not giving me a really big solo, but I worked really hard, and I'd never in my life sang with a piano accompaniment that wasn't me doing Broadway on the piano and that sort of thing. And it was a different modality, and I was terrified. Plus, we're in the Blaustein Hall, which is this elevated place in just near the former seam overlooking the walls of the old city Jerusalem. So imagine this backdrop for your first High Holy Days as a rabbinical student, that you're sitting there about to sing, and behind you is the Jaffa Gate that you can, I mean, it's just a sight that you can't even imagine to have High Holy Days in this place. And I was so nervous, so I got up there and the piano started, and I remember very clearly that I opened up my mouth and what came out was Nekadesh. Is about that loud. Yeah. So when that service was over, Tovia came up to me and he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "You're a musician. You've got a voice. You are singing words that are meant to be in the throne room of heaven. You are representing yourself and Abraham Geiger Kolleg and HUC in front of all these people. and you step up, and what you're supposed to do, and this is a very typical Tovia thing to do, is say, Nagadesh! If you ever, he had a voice.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounded like a trumpet. He sounded, I mean, if you can just imagine a human voice matched with a trumpet, that's what he sounded like. It wasn't like this beautiful voice, but it was an accurate voice, and it could cut through metal in order to get out there. And it was a deep criticism, because he did, and I tried to make the excuse. I'm like, well, I've never sang in this respect before. And he's like, you step out with boldness. If you're going to do anything, you do it with every bit of heart and mind and soul you have. And again, I get really upset that we seem to be stepping into a type of society where we're not allowed to have any of these sorts of criticisms. And Tovia was old school. And I know that some people hear that and hate that as an excuse and that sort of thing. He was not rude. He was not inappropriate. He called me out on something I could have done better. It could have been better. And because of that, I started taking vocal lessons. And I studied for a year with an amazing human being named Jay Shear, which, if you speak Hebrew, you know that's the best name for a vocal coach ever. And it put me on a road to where although I'm by no stretch of the imagination a cantor nor an invested cantor, I studied multiple years cantorial studies and have functioned as a cantor in many of the different places that I've been posted. And my ability to do it is not completely based on what Tovia said, but it absolutely got its start from him criticizing me, but criticizing in the sense of, I know you can do better. What are you going to do? And that challenge, but also the call out at the time. He didn't give me that was really nice. He didn't do that because he knew that I was capable of something different. And that was a life-changing moment that he didn't say, Yasher Koach. What he said was, no, I don't want that to be strengthened. I want you to actually strengthen what you're doing. I want you to make that stronger. I want you to do that the way that you can. And that was a heck of a moment, but it completely led me in the direction that I went in, wanting to learn more about cantorial studies and studying privately and taking voice lessons several times in my life. And yeah, that was an amazing moment.
But from what I hear, what you're saying, I get the impression that this was also kind of that he voiced this not as in a negative way, but really like also in the framework of like rebuke from a Jewish standpoint.
Yeah.
Kind of, it sounds like he didn't say like, how awful is this or whatnot, but that he from what you say, I also hear there's curiosity. What a word! I can never pronounce this word correctly. That he really didn't understand. You are a musician, and why? What's wrong? What happened that this came out in a non-musical or like a professional musician?
He wanted to understand. He really, it was, you're right, it was tocha. It was absolutely rebuke. It was curiosity. It was dialogue. It was teaching through all those things. He had a definite message that he was giving me, but behind all that, and I guess maybe that's the sort of thing, and maybe as we've made it less and less safe for anyone to criticize anything in any sort of situation. I think that part of the lesson we can learn is, how did he do that? And yes, entering that with curiosity. I want to understand what I heard, and it's interesting. I saw him be criticized once in a certain situation where there were some youth that were leading some prayers, and then you couldn't hear them. So it was a very similar situation. And he jumped in and he kind of lended his voice to support it. And I know there was some criticism on there's Tovia taking over. Two things were happening there. One, he was trying to support them because they were falling. But the other thing was, he was being very true to this idea that if there's a Jewish moment going on, then you put your entire heart and soul into it. And he felt his job was to make sure that he was there, that he was supporting it. Was it the best pedagogical thing to do? I have no idea, but we got through that Birkat Hamazon, and I do know that some of those people who were being supported at that moment have gone on to positions of Jewish leadership. So it obviously did not negatively affect them. But he did things in ways that are not necessarily how we'd recommend them be done today. Just from, again, the critique in there, the rebuke, just to throw it out there as well, completely appropriate from a Jewish halakhic standpoint. It was one-on-one. It was away from everyone else. It was a conversation. He didn't step up in front of all these people who were my peers and say, what were you thinking of? He took me aside, and I've got critique. I want to understand it. And he was very dramatic about it. He gave me the example of what he wanted to hear. Interestingly enough, the last time I actually did that melody, I stepped out and I could hear nothing but Tovia's voice, and I was a little bit more trumpety than usual when I came out and sang Nagadesh. And what an amazing feeling to let those notes come out, and to know that I used to not be able to do that. Now I can. That process of moving from not to can was because of how a teacher dealt with his student.
Yeah. So it really had an impact on your life.
I guess that's one of the main reasons I wanted to just talk about. There's always the danger of, you're making this about you, and when your mentors pass, like, I don't know how else to do this. Here's a single teacher who has had as much of an effect on my life as just about any teacher I've ever had. I mean, as far as people in my rabbinical journey, I can name 3 others other than Tovia that have had this profound level of an effect. Eliyahu Schleifer being another one, since I've already mentioned his name there. And so, if that's the case, it needs to be honored. It needs to be recognized for what that is, and maybe even how usual it is. But the reality is a single person changed the entire course of my life through incidences like that, through taking what it meant to be a teacher and a mentor so seriously that they were always, that's who they were as a human being. He was always on in that situation. And maybe I didn't want that all the time, but that's immaterial to what I needed. Yeah. Did I want him to criticize me? I already felt bad about it because I was feeling really weak in my voice. And, I'm used to standing up on stage as a jazz musician and playing all night long and not even giving a second thought about it. And I've always been insecure about my voice. And so I was there existing within my insecurities, and he came out and it could have destroyed me. But instead, with that mixture, as you pointed out, with the curiosity and every aspect that was there, instead he lifted me out of it and helped me to want to do better. And I did. So the entire trajectory of my life, I don't know what I would do as a rabbi without being able to use my voice now the way that I can. Not in the way that I'd want, but I guess that's the Tovia thing, that my entire life I've got to get better. And
as you mentioned that you had the chance to tell him about how this primitive man quote had an impact on your life, did you also have the chance to tell him this story?
I don't remember if I did or not. I don't know if... I don't actually remember. I don't know if Tovia got to hear me in a cantorial capacity. He did see me at Geiger grow over that time. So I don't even think it was necessary because, of course, we, had regular leading of services and that sort of thing. So he was able to see over the course of the 5 years of rabbinical school how that changed. So I don't even think that was necessary. That being said, I mean, what a lame excuse there. Listen, if you take anything away from this, call up a teacher that you love who you've never said how important they are, and tell them something that they did. So
this is like what I wanted to say. I think that we just miss out so often on opportunities to actually tell our teachers, like, you once 10 years ago, 20 years ago said this and this really had an impact on my life and changed me forever. And then just like, as he said with the primitive man quote, that he said like, oh, that's a great quote. I can't even remember that I said it. It's somehow, it's lovely, but at the same time, you gave him like a feedback on what an impact for him a simple thing had on your life. And I think we just really miss out on opportunities to give thanks to people who have an impact in our life and on our lives. And I think we should just do this more often. Even if it was criticism or something like this, but
it shouldn't matter if it actually this moved us and elevated us.
story about your vocal solo was really, I mean, yeah, it changed you. And he's still walking through the house and singing really loudly.
It's
so
probably a good thing that we live
and all the walls are shaking.
in a stone house now. Yes, because living in apartment buildings was a little bit harder for me to do that. Yes, living where we're living now, I get to break out into song quite a bit more often. Not that it's ever really held me back.
That's true. But talking about that, criticism and so on, I assume that you just as two Jews, three opinions, you probably on occasion disagreed with him or with each other, and I was wondering if you could maybe give us some examples, kind of where you disagreed maybe, and maybe had a machloket l'shem hashamayim, and and back then you saw this maybe as a student, and what do you think about these things today? Because I mean, with this with the story that we just talked about, I bet you were quite upset when he pointed it out, because you knew it and you were upset already with yourself that you don't have a strong voice, and that this little man had a stronger voice than you had. But it brought you to a different and better place, I think. And so maybe you can give us some examples.
There's, again, finishing the book that I'm about to have out there, it's more apparent to me, and over the last 2 days I've just been rereading a lot of the book, the amount of things that are in there because of some influence from Tovia are huge. But there's actually a section in the middle, an interlude that I have that is based on something that another rabbinic mentor had said to me at one point. But I realized how much towards the end that is really influenced by Tovia as well. And what that question brings to mind was, in practical rabbinics, this was in a formal classroom situation. One of the things in Germany that you're told as a rabbinical student when you go to the communities is don't say the word God. And there's a lot of reasons for that. 85% of the Jews in Germany are former Soviet Union. And, we've got 3+ generations of state institutionalized atheism. And if you invoke God as a word, oftentimes people will just shut you down. And so I used to not do that. I used to play around with that. But, Tovia would talk about that quite a bit. And he had no problem invoking the name of God. That he was not the person who said, either invoking the word God or the name of God. He was not the person who said you shouldn't do that, that those were other teachers. But what he used to talk about was, how do you talk to an atheist? And he loved it. If you actually Google him, you will see some of his interviews that he gave. It's one of the things that you'll just see with Tovia. And how I talk with atheists, you see that in the book. One of the quotes that he gave me, it's literally in the book. And a lot of the things, you're supposed to always give credit to the people who taught you something. And I might actually have to add credit in a few places of the book because of how much influence. But the way when someone says, I don't believe in God, my answer to them is 50% influenced by him. But we had a class once where he said, people will ask you what you believe, what your theology is. And so he just went around the room to each of the students there. He said, what do you believe? What do you believe? And he got to me, and I, in rabbinical school, I had an even higher opinion of myself than I do now. And I am a panentheist, and if you want to know what that means, I'm not sure if class was supposed to be last week, didn't happen. I'm not sure if it's going to be this Sunday or a week from Sunday, because I really have to look at the calendar, and this week has been weird because of what we're doing right now. But I have a class, it's either going to be this Sunday or a week from Sunday, called Extheism, where we actually talk. And why this class? This comes from Tovia, this entire idea. When we say I am a theist, when we say I'm a pantheist, when we say I'm a panentheist, if someone's a polytheist, do we know what that means? Do we know what we actually are? Do we know where it falls in? So I consider myself a panentheist. And no, I'm not going to say what it is. You have to join BeitVirtuali and come to the class. And then Tovia said, what is that? And whether he knew it or he was just goading me on or whatever. And so I start into a university lecture on what panentheism is. He says, stop. He says, everyone has just turned off their brain. You have to be able to say that in a few words. And I said, no, I'm not going to say it in a few words because it's complicated what I believe. That was our machloket. And we talked about it for quite some time. Guess who was right? Tovia. And the reason Tovia is right is I can't jump into the deeper explanation until someone has bought into the conversation, and they're not going to buy into the conversation if you overwhelm them with just how brilliant you are. And not only am I not brilliant enough to pull that off or brilliant at all to be able to even think that I could pull something like that off, but he's completely right in that you are going to turn off any attempt at that conversation by not understanding. And so there is an elevator speech on these questions that, in business, you have to have your elevator speech for your business. There's no difference if you're a rabbi. When someone comes up and says, why should I bother coming to synagogue? And this comes from Tovia. You should be able to answer them, and you should have a strong answer. It should make sense, and it should be the opening of a conversation, which means it has to be quick and succinct, and you have to have thought about it. And when it comes to what do you believe, and yes, have I actually had congregation members in Germany and in Switzerland and in England and in the United States come up and ask me what I believe? You better believe it. And the older I got, guess what? They became more like the answers that Tovia would want to hear. Because what I learned over time was exactly what Tovia told me would happen, and that's that people, if I go into the university lecture, will shut off their brains and stop listening because they asked for a statement. They didn't ask for a lecture. So that was a huge machloket. I still believe that we should allow for complexity to exist. We shouldn't exist within headlines. That wasn't what he was suggesting, though. Yeah. He was making a clear comment on my inability to be distinct and clear with what I was saying. And as we're sitting here rambling on the long podcast, but this is a long format podcast, so we actually get to do that. It was a machloket. I, for many years, was actually a little bit annoyed with the discussion. Tovia turned out to be right.
Yeah, I'm also always ambivalent about this, because I also think that there are complex things that need longer explanations and so on. And I always have to think of, I think it was the movie Philadelphia, when I think the lawyer of Tom Hanks,
Denzel Washington, I think.
Oh yeah, it was Denzel Washington. He was in court, and he always said, like, when someone had a long explanation, he always said, like, okay, so now please explain this to me as if I was a 2-year-old child. Yeah. And it's basically the same concept. And I was always struggling with this because, there are complex things, but I think what he maybe meant in the end of the day is that you really have to find a shorter version to kind of cause a spark of interest or something like this. Yeah. And then if a person says, like, that's interesting, can you elaborate on it? Then this person is, then you got the person, and they want to be engaged and want to learn more about it.
Well, and I think the other side, that's one side to it, and that took me a long time to understand, that someone asking me a question did not mean that they'd had buy-in to a long conversation. It just meant they went. So it's the good old way that I've seen this manifest quite a bit, as someone saying, do you believe in God? Which seems like a weird question to ask a rabbi, but this came a lot more often before I was in rabbinical school. Just in the States, I used to not always cover up my kippah with a hat. And as I was traveling as a consultant, and people would ask me about views of God and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And what I said for a long time is, first of all, tell me, when you ask me, do I believe in God, what do you imagine God to be? Because if I say yes, then am I saying yes? Are you hearing that I believe in the same God as you do? If you believe that God is a bearded dude in the sky, who looks over your shoulder to see if you've been naughty or nice and zaps you for doing the wrong thing, I don't believe in that God. Mm-hmm. Not even remotely, not in any way, shape, or form. So if someone says, I believe in God, and that's what's in their head, then my answer to that is no. There's a lot of dialogue that has to happen, but in order for that dialogue to happen, there has to be buy-in. So what comes first, the chicken or the egg on that one? But the other part of that conversation with Tovia in class that I think is so important is, do I know what I actually believe? Because it's one thing for me to say, all right, I'm a pantheist, and this comes from this, and it means this, and it implies this. All right, great. I've just shown, as my freshman English teacher in high school said, that I'm intoxicated with the exuberance of my own veracity. Not very helpful. I know, exactly. So John Harris of blessed memory. Thank you for that line. Do I have the ability to act? Do I know what I want to say enough? Do I actually understand this complex thing enough in my mind that I can shorten it, that I can actually clearly state it, even if there's more to it than this, but here's the core of it. Can I actually express what the core is, no matter how complicated it is? And there are people, I mean, if you read the really good physicists that are out there that are also communicating in the world, they take things that are impossible to understand, and then they found ways to be able to still communicate that. And when we actually read in various disciplines people whose prose is so opaque that you can't understand a single thing that they're saying, then you have to ask the question on, do they know what they're saying, or are they being deliberately opaque in order to obscure what they're saying? And so then I have to look back and let Tovia be a reflection of me. Was I trying to obscure what I was saying? Was I trying to not really give an answer by trying to be more complex? So that was a heck of an argument. Turned out that he was right for a variety of reasons. And how conscious was he in all those? Knowing Tovia, actually pretty conscious, because he's been asked that question over the course of his career. How many times? You know? So he was right. I was wrong. It was a great argument. He turned out to have the right wisdom.
And did he also elaborate on what he is? Like,
Yine. So yes and no. He always let his students have the dialogue. He never tried to place his thoughts in the students. So he was one of those people, another religious leader to me say years ago, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. Tovia was the sermon that you saw. Even though he gave very long and sometimes rambling sermons, he was still like talking about the saying hello and thank you to every single person on the staff. You know, if he's talking about love your neighbor as yourself and the stranger in your midst, love as yourself because you were once strangers in Egypt. I actually watched Tovia do that his entire life. I never saw a single moment where Tovia did not act that way. He was a human being. I'm sure that he acted that way on occasion, but I, being around him a lot for many years, never saw him do anything other than that. So, you know, what did he believe? He believed in the type of relationship with deity that he took very seriously, our obligation to love your neighbor as yourself. That's what he wanted to do, was be the visible mentor, as opposed to necessarily say something philosophically beautiful that was not reflected in his actions. His actions always reflected what he said he believed. And if he didn't say what he believed, his actions gave you a sense of what he believed regardless.
yeah.
Which I'm not going to add on to that because that's probably about the most succinct thing I've said for the last 45 minutes.
So what do you think his legacy is that he leaves behind?
You know, several of my colleagues and friends that have been posted, and basically anyone who studied with him has posted something, whether their own thoughts or whether, you know, they've found in one of the many articles that's come up in the last day. A lot of people are talking about his exuberance, his energy, his smile. And that can sound very surface. It's not to be surface at all. I've said this before, but I think that this is the legacy. And this is also the point in the interlude in my book that I was talking about, this really comes from him. If you do something, do it with everything you've got. So he gave me an example that I used actively in the States, especially with bar and bat mitzvah students. He brought in a copy of Harry Potter to one of the classes, and he opened it up, and I don't remember if it was English or German. He opened it up and Harry lifted his wand, and he started reading it deadpan, boring as possible. And then he went through talking about the pedagogy of working with bar and bat mitzvah students, and the point that he was making is this is what he did with his students, and he was demonstrating to us, and that is Do you want to hear a book read that way? Well, of course not. Then why in the world do you get up and read Torah and say, and the answer for that could be very complex, just like with me singing the Lewandowski. I might be singing it very quietly because I'm scared out of my mind, which is obviously the case with a lot of bar and bat mitzvah students. But his point was, then don't practice being scared. Yeah. Start from the very beginning with, if this is Torah, how much more so is it important that we read with passion? More than we would read Harry Potter with passion. So if we don't want to listen to Harry Potter read that way, then of course no one wants to hear Torah read without some sort of passion. And that idea right there, it didn't matter what he did. If he stepped onto a bima and he wasn't going to do anything for 35 minutes because the chazan was coming up to do their thing, he would still be up there beaming. If he saw a kid running through, you've seen it, running through Pestalozzi Strasse, he would lean over and make that eye contact and let that child know that they were the most... How many synagogues have we been to where... And listen, I get distracted by kids running up when I'm reading Torah and yanking on my talus or my leg. It's happened. But how many times have we been where kids are shown that they're not welcome? And he would, he could do away with his eyes. That's not appropriate what you're doing, at the same time letting them know they are a human being. They're absolutely welcome. So if he's sitting on the bima, he's sitting there with his full passion. Yeah. Where when he was Rabbi Pestalozzi Strasse, the job of the rabbi there is not exactly the sort of stuff that I was doing in the States or even in England. The rabbi says the Shema and the Ve'ahavta and then gives a sermon. Now, obviously, rabbis do a lot more than that. That's the public-facing things. But it's the chazan who's doing this liturgy. And the rabbi, in that moment, now, if you're one of the people who believes that a rabbi shouldn't get paid very much because all they do is give a sermon, you have no idea what a rabbi actually does. That's a different story altogether. But on the bima, in that particular community, he would chant Shema Ve'ahavta, and then he would give the sermon. You felt that Shema Ve'ahavta with every part of your being. It didn't matter what he did. If he was in a meeting with the students, he taught with his entire heart. If he was in a board meeting, if he was in... And he would give the examples of the discussions that he'd had with different groups of people. He did interfaith par excellence. He was one of the very much in demand people to do interfaith. He just stepped into everything he did with full passion. So what's his legacy? Anyone who studied with him has this idea that if you're going to do something, it's worth doing completely. And with that, everything falls beneath that. Everything is a part of that. The love of Judaism, it's how you do it. And that's where it all ties together. If Judaism is something that we care about, then why are we acting like we don't care about it? When we why are we... Something, and again, this is something from Tovia, and I didn't even realize it. I just reread this chapter today. Didn't even realize it until he died, that how much this is influenced. But there's the end of this interlude where I'm talking about Mrs. Goldstein. You'll just have to buy the book. It is coming out very soon now. And Mrs. Goldstein is talking about how she has one thing that she wants to communicate to us, and that's that if we do something, do it with passion, and how much she hates when there's not a minyan. Why? Because there's not enough people. No, that's not the point. It's the point that the person gets up there to lead the service and turns around and says, well, we don't have a minyan, and then continues to punish the people who did show up by doing a passionless, I'm mad, flipping the pages. Like, what about the 7 people that did show up? Lead that service as if you've got 500 people, and for those 7 people, make it the most meaningful experience you've ever had. And I can definitely say that one of the most meaningful services I ever led was a Sukkot morning service in the rain outside at Kol Shalom on Bainbridge Island, where there were about 7 of us there, and we sat in a circle and we made one of the most beautiful Sukkots ever. Why? Because Tovia, somewhere in the back of my brain, is saying those people should never be punished for coming. You reward them. So what if you can't do a borchu? So what if you're not going to pull out the Torah scroll? You absolutely make that, and we had a meaningful service. And that's his legacy. If it's worth doing, then it's worth doing with every bit of your being. And I've had 2 rabbis that gave that message to me, and two very different rabbis, Jonathan Singer and Tovia Ben-Chorin. And the 2 of them, from 2 completely different perspectives, you're going to do it, you're going to put everything into it. And that's now affected how I write. That's now affected podcasts and the sermons that I'm giving. And I'm in my own series of struggles as my life is switching over, but that voice is always in the back of my brain there as well. Do it with everything you've got.
Yeah.
So that's his legacy for me.
And I really think that you always did this in the past when you were a congregational rabbi. You always honored the people who were there, no matter.
There's a few people, and it's not everyone. It's not every teacher you've ever had that you visualize on what would so and so say if they came to the service. I actually remember very well. I'm not going to say what synagogue it is because it would be politically very incorrect. I remember going to a synagogue. I will say it wasn't in Berlin, so that will make it very. I'm not even say what country it was in, but I was at a synagogue with Tovia, and we were there very early, and he pointed out the paroquet, the curtain in front of the ark was slightly ajar. There was a stack of really uneven music books and papers in one location. And he just started pointing out everything that was wrong. And it felt really strange. It felt like a very strange nitpicking sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And then after we went through and he pointed everything out that was wrong, he then made his case. He said, what's going to happen now is people that as a rabbi, you want to be fully invested in what you're doing as a rabbi or as a chazan or as a shlach tzibur or as a prayer leader. You want them fully invested. And the average human being is going to sit there, and it's going to be easier for them to get distracted by the half-open curtain. And so what he taught me is you walk into a building, and the first thing that you do is you walk around the bima, and you look for anything that you think is going to distract someone. You remove any excuse that there is for someone to be distracted so that they have to listen to you. And so because of that, every time I walked into a synagogue for my entire life after that, where I was primarily responsible for what was going on, I would do that for a couple of reasons. One, he was right. Number two, he was one of the rabbis that I imagined always in the States, in England, didn't matter in Germany. What would Tovia be looking at and thinking about if he actually came into this? And I know that we all have the what would so-and-so do sorts of things, but if you're really honest as a service leader, there's not that many people that you actually imagine wanting to be pleased with you. And there's all the levels of ego gratification and ask not why a person does a good thing. But I would want Tovia, more than just about anyone, to be in the back of the service and say, yeah, you did that. Which, I guess that's going to be about it. Let's go ahead and do a l'chaim to Tovia.
Yep.
And
also, I don't want to destroy your last word, but I find this really yakkish of him that he pointed it out, and I have to agree, he's right. I said so many times in synagogues and thought like, this is not in order, and this is not in order, and...
Yep.
And it was really nice talking with you about him, because it also reminded me of, some things that I encountered with him that I probably forgot. And I think, he was always kind of a calm presence. I think he always, I don't know if he raised his voice ever, but he was like, is how I experienced this. He was this calm presence.
He projected his voice, but did not raise his voice.
Exactly. But then, as I said, he was a really small man, but he had like this presence, a great presence, and he was, as you say, he always gave everything when he did his part in a service, or when he was asked to give a sermon. And he did it full-heartedly and with joy, and gave everything to the community. Yeah. And
his memory will always be a blessing.
Yep.
Here's to you, Tovia. And with that, sermon coming up tomorrow. Still need to hear from you if you want me to start doing services again, maybe once a month. So haven't heard from a whole lot of people yet, just 4 or 5. That's not enough. So if you want to us to start doing services again, let me know. Just comments down below, or send me an email, BeitVirtuali at gmail.com. Class coming up, those of you who are members of BeitVirtuali, I will update the calendar tomorrow. Sorry, this has set me back a little bit, and I know that some of you who are planning on coming are not going to be in town on Sunday, so I might push everything back a week. So, and I think that I might just need this weekend to chill out a little bit. So anyway, I promise I will get that out. If you're not a member of BeitVirtuali and you want to be a part of our upcoming adult education, just join at the lowest level and then quit after a month if you hate it. But I think that you'll actually end up staying around. Our adult education and the discussions we've gotten in has been actually some of the most satisfying of my entire career. It's been, boy, have we had some discussions. And if anyone wants to do that deep dive. And then Gateways into Judaism Volume 1 Origins will be coming out in spring. I promised it would be spring 2022. It will be coming out in spring. So be looking for that. It will be available on Amazon in hardcover and quality paperback, as well as Kindle. So that will be coming out relatively soon. And I have never been more excited about anything I've ever written in my life than this. So I'm excited not only because I want to get it out there, but I'm excited for you all to read it. I actually want to hear from you and discuss with you and go to Limud and be invited to your synagogues to talk about it. And I'm really excited about this. So thank you all for being a part of BeitVirtuali, for giving us a little bit of your time. As always, let us know what your questions are. We will still only one question that I've gotten that we have not addressed in a podcast that someone wanted us to. We will do that one of these days. But let us know what you want us to talk about. We'll get back to our regular doing this every other week. So that's, we're committing to do that. We're going to do that one way or another. The question is when Katrin needs to travel. So if it's a little bit weird sometimes on this date during that or that, we still have equilibrium to find. Anyway, take care. Everyone stay healthy, lift each other up, and go email, or better yet, call a teacher that impacted your life. Yeah. And tell them that. Yeah. Okay. Take care, everyone. See you next time.
All right.